All right, man. I know we talked a little bit before, but still, for those who are not familiar with you, can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm Nico. Like we just talked about, I was born and raised in Germany. The accent doesn't really give it away anymore. But I came over here for high school for 1 year. Really liked it over here. Went back to Germany, played some hoops, and finished up school there. And then when it was time for me to, kind of pick a career and go to school, I was really intrigued by, strength and conditioning, human performance, all that stuff. Kind of was familiar with the area that I stayed in the US, and then came back came back in 2017 to a smaller school in Missouri to get my undergrad. Throughout my undergrad, just kind of volunteered, interned my time in the weight room, getting involved with strength and conditioning. Also got involved with some research projects. That's where I kind of got my interest peaked in the scientific side and research. And then yeah, I was really interested in those two things and was hoping to merge those. And that's kind of when the whole sports science profession kind of became a little bit bigger. So merging those two was really cool for me. Ended up doing a master's and then a PhD at the University of Kansas in the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab, which was awesome because I got to, scratch my research interest, but also be involved kind of in the applied science, applied sports science side of things with their basketball team. Yeah, and then last year, last summer, joined the Denver Nuggets here in the NBA for a sports science and strength and conditioning role. So that's kind of a brief rundown.
Nice, nice. So, uh, I guess my first question would be like, since you're from German, and I know like they also have like pretty good uh SNC or like sports science background, like, do you still like communicate with them or like, yeah.
Yeah, I never really started, building a network or doing any strength and conditioning in Germany much. I know I kind of started out, but most of the contacts that I've made and kind of the network that I've built has been stateside. But with that being said, I do have contact to a couple coaches and sports scientists over in Germany, and it's good to connect with them, see what they're up to. So yeah.
Do you th do you feel like there's a lot of like difference between this the overall like strength and conditioning sports science culture over there and uh the stuff in the state?
Um, I'm sure there is. Given that I haven't worked a ton over there and haven't gotten a ton of experience, I'm not sure if I'm the most qualified to answer that question. But I think a lot of those European countries, I think, especially, with soccer and that kind of stuff, is a little bit more advanced on the research side of things and maybe the sports science side of things, while I think the US may have a leg up just by, boots on the ground coaching, just with there being a lot more coaching positions open, whether that's, high school, college, professional sports, just with how different the setup is between there being essentially no like high school and college sports in Europe. So I think that's probably the biggest difference that I would see, in my opinion.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
So I remember last time we talked, you kind of mentioned that uh you work with a lot of like change of direction and force plate stuff, right? So
Yeah.
like this goes back to like last summer me and Adam went on a trip to do like the whole deceleration thing or change of direction thing. So uh I want to ask like for training or monitoring change of direction, um do you think like what like I'll ask it this way. What do you think are the best tests to to see those quality or like just monitor those qualities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a number of different ways to go about it. Um, I think it all comes back to what the demands of the sport are, and can we to a certain extent mimic or replicate those demands in a more controlled environment where we can collect quality data, which I think actually in basketball, I'm just going to use basketball since I know you've worked in it. I work in it currently. There's not a ton of literature available as to how athletes actually decelerate and change direction as part of gameplay, and that's a big question that I'm after currently with there being more literature available in soccer, we know what the entry velocities are. We know what the entry distances are. We know what the deceleration distances are. We're more familiar with what the angles are of change of direction. Is the majority greater than 90 degrees, less than 90 degrees? How many 180-degree cuts do we actually see? And that then kind of makes you question some of the available assessments and how they replicate those demands. But I think coming back to where we started, I think there's a number of different ways to assess deceleration and change of direction ability. I'm gonna just talk about it horizontally, not vertically, because vertically we can obviously do it with force plates, but if you're stuck with just a stopwatch, a tape measure, timing gates, that kind of stuff, it's obviously doable. Whether it's an acceleration to deceleration assessment and just testing over a certain approach distance, how quickly can athlete come to a stop and then just measuring that, or doing something like a modified 505 change of direction test and just timing that. I'd say the gold standard though is you'd want to measure the instantaneous velocity, whether that's with radar technology, LiDAR, IMUs, motorized resistance like 1080 T-Apex, like those types of companies, because then you can get those metrics that you're interested in based on the instantaneous velocity trace, whether that's a maximal approach speed, your deceleration distance, your average deceleration, your average acceleration, how quickly can they re-accelerate coming out of a cut. So I think those are some thoughts that I would have in that realm, but I think a lot of times, and this goes more globally too, I think the whole sports science field is a lot of times we start with a metric or a technology in mind rather than, you know, trying to investigate a question first or trying to see, okay, how do athletes actually decelerate and change direction based on gameplay and what they do in game, and then how can we design an assessment around that? And then once we have the assessment, what technology or what tools can we use to then measure that quality? So I think yeah, those are just some thoughts that I have, but that's obviously a really good question that we could talk talk in more detail about too.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it. So, when talk about like change of direction, you mentioned like lateral deceleration or change of direction. Do you think that this is a very vague question, but like, do you think that like the overall like counter movement jump really are able to predict lateral or like linear deceleration?
Um, Yes and no. And there is some studies that are available. I know Damian Harper's published a paper on it. We've published a paper on it with a basketball population where we looked at some relationships between force time variables derived from a vertical counter movement jump and then some horizontal deceleration metrics from in our case, it was a 10-meter acceleration to deceleration assessment. So athlete sprints for 10 meters, then slams on the brakes, comes to a stop and backpedals. There were some significant correlations. Prior to doing that study, I probably would have. like most people out there, would have hypothesized a lot of the braking type metrics from the counter movement jump to be related to a horizontal deceleration, which wasn't the case. A lot of a lot of the metrics that we saw being significantly correlated were more so pointing towards like, vertical propulsive force qualities, whether that's just like an outcome variable like a jump height or a reactive strength index modified um or a propulsive power or a mean propulsive force, like those variables seem to be more strongly correlated, which kind of tracks with other data that have been shown in the field, being able to produce force at higher velocities concentrically being related to horizontal deceleration. So yeah, there are some correlations, but I feel like those metrics from the counter movement jump more so point towards overall stretch shortening cycle efficiency, not maybe not efficiency, but overall athleticism rather than like braking rate of force development or braking impulse from a counter movement jump then being related to like a braking type metric in a horizontal test. So there is some correlations, but not necessarily with the metrics that we would have hypothesized to begin with.
Cool. So besides those metrics, do you like when you coach or when you teach change direction, um, what are like some qualities or like some key points that you're gonna look at when you coach an athlete how to change a direction or decelerate?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what I'm gonna say here is probably largely based on a lot of the work by Tom DeSantos. I know he's done a lot of work in the space as far as like technique and biomechanics modifications for deceleration, change of direction. I think some of the most important points, and this is, very, very broad, but you know, we want to be able to lower our center of mass when we decelerate. Heel first. If we think of our shin as a steering wheel, shin faces forward, we accelerate, shin faces backward, heel touch first. We decelerate. I think the preparation steps prior to a change of direction event are very important. I think the more force we can generate or the higher impulse we can generate earlier in the braking steps, the easier it is for us to then on that final foot contact push off and have a faster change of direction event. So using cues like, slam the ground or punch the ground or things like that when we're coaching that penultimate footstep or the anti-penultimate footstep just to create a higher impulse prior to that final foot contact. I think those are some of the main cues that we look for, and that's primarily speaking to like a 180-degree turn here because that's where most of the literature is available. But then again, like I'm down this rabbit hole right now where I'm questioning how many times in a game do we see a 180-degree turn for a basketball player, for instance. So then it's like, okay, let's find out first at which angles players actually cut and then build from there. But yeah, long-winded answer, but I think that's kind of where my head is at.
Yeah, that's good. That's good because like I remember when we go on the trip and do all the like testing. Yeah, we also find out that like the pre-penultimate step and the penultimate step are probably more important than the pivot step. And like you have to have like what's so called medial trunk lean.
Hmm.
But the following question would be like those are the qualities that or like you mentioned like 180-degree turns, but like those are the qualities that like if we do a test, right? It's a closed drill situation. And
Hmm.
how much does that gonna affect like a basketball game since it's a more chaotic? You don't really know, like you don't really have a plan what are the opponents gonna do, right? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point because obviously in like our coaching setting we have these progressions, whether it's like extensive to intensive or more controlled to less controlled, more chaos. I think that's similar progressions that would apply here for, horizontal deceleration, change of direction events. Um, I think that there's certain drills that we could probably do, whether that's, reacting to some kind of stimulus, whether that's like auditory or visual, um, and then initiating a change of direction event, and then progressing that from there. I think there's some options there. And then in a lot of ways, right, it's hard to replicate the demands of the sport if you're not playing the sport. So I think working on some of these qualities in a more controlled environment and giving the athletes those tools to then use in a sporting setting can also be helpful. But I think there certainly is some progressions that we could go through going from like a very controlled environment like a ADA like we talked about or a 505 change of direction test to something where the athlete has to react to a stimulus, whether it's, visual, auditory, whatever that may be, and then trying to translate some of those things into a more game-like environment using small-sided games, 1v1, 2v1, 2v2, and so on. So yeah, that's kind of what my thoughts are here.
Cool. So, like you mentioned, a lot of the D-series study are the subjects are either soccer or American football, right? Th there's actually not a lot of like normalized like XYZ axis of research on basketball. So, um, do you think like I know you kind of already answered that, but do you think that the same quality like can transfer from sport to sport?
Yeah, I think it can. And I think that a lot of those qualities, especially at like I wouldn't say lower levels, but with younger athletes probably have more carryover. But then once those qualities are built, I think you can become more nuanced. Considering, for example, the dimensions of the playing field, we see a lot of longer approach distances and higher approach speeds preceding decelerations and change of direction events in sports where the playing field is so much larger, like soccer or American football. And then we have sports where the playing field is just more condensed, like basketball or even something like tennis. So, coming back to what we said, just considering those environmental constraints in building our assessments and our training prescriptions to get closer to the demands of the sport, I think is an important consideration to make.
Cool. Um, so a lot, I think a lot, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of like the change of direction or like deceleration, like the training, it also came from American football or soccer. So in basketball world, like how much time or like yeah, how much time do you get to train or get to teach them like the basic movement of like change of direction?
Yeah, I think it obviously depends on the time of the year. You probably get a little bit more time to dedicate towards those qualities, let's say in the summertime when you're not in season. But I'm a big proponent of sprinkling those things in throughout the year. I think dynamic warm-ups can be a great time and place to do such a thing. I think a lot of times we just, run through the motions with that and don't really pay much attention to it. But let's say you do a dynamic warm-up before every practice and every shoot around, even in game. Um, I think there are certain qualities from a deceleration and change of direction perspective that you can work on, and then even within that progress over time, going from less intense to more intense, going from less chaotic to more chaotic if you want to introduce some small-sided games and that kind of stuff. So I think obviously given the constraints of the in-season and travel and schedule and all that stuff, and you probably dedicate more time with players in season that play less, and then those players that play more in season, you probably dedicate more time in the summer or outside of the season. But I think throughout the year, you always have the opportunity to sprinkle in some of the training into your dynamic warm-ups and things like that.
And uh do you like in terms of like monitoring those quality or like those physical capacity, uh what kind of tests do you like use to check those qualities?
Yeah, I think if we, I would look at it through two lenses, and this is not necessarily something we're currently doing. This is just something that I've done in the past. But I would say if we're going more so for like a controlled environment for a validated test, like we've done acceleration to deceleration assessments over varying approach distances, usually like 5 or 10 meters, just because that kind of matches some of the deceleration events that we do see in basketball. Um, and then also, like 505 change of direction tests over 180-degree turns, 90-degree turns, whether we can use motorized resistance to measure that using devices like a 1080 or a T-Apex. In the past, when I've done those tests, we've used radar technology that's a little bit more cumbersome on the back end from downloading and treating the data, but those are options. Um, we can use wearables, like if we wear a IMU during practice or a game, or we have optical tracking in game, we can use that data. And I'd say that's more of like the second bucket. So now we're like going away from like our standardized assessments, and now we're going more towards that in situ approach that I know JB Marin, some of those researchers in Europe have made a little bit more popular from like a uh, acceleration speed profiling perspective using in-game data and not taking away from the athlete's time and kind of moving towards that invisible monitoring um, approach. So there are some things that we can do there with modeling out some of like the instantaneous velocity and acceleration numbers that we get from practices and games. So that's an avenue that we've explored as well over recent years.
Cool. So, uh, uh, when talk about like deceleration, I think in basketball world, like the most common test like we use is still counter move and jump. But uh, like I mentioned last year, we went on a trip and we kind of found out that the tests that mo have the highest correlation with change of direction is actually like single leg counter movement jump or single leg drop jump. Do you do you think that is a test that potentially is potentially that practitioner going to do more in the future? Because I see a lot of like those tests being done in the return to play setting, like not like day-to-day performance, like monitoring those stuff. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent on, unilateral assessments, not just bilateral assessments. Obviously when you're crunched for time, a lot of times, you kind of have to prioritize one or the other, and it also depends on why or how you're measuring it, right? Are we trying to track fatigue? Are we trying to track readiness? Is it a return to play scenario? But yeah, I can definitely see how there's more of a correlation between like a unilateral counter movement jump and drop jump. And we know this from the research side, I think a lot of times certain force generation qualities can get masked when we do a bilateral assessment, and then, following up and doing a unilateral assessments, a lot of times we can kind of unmask some of those deficiencies or movement qualities that we cannot see with a bilateral assessment. So I think if the time and the place is right, I would always, you know, do a unilateral assessment paired with a bilateral assessment, in this case, like a counter movement jump or a drop jump.
Cool, cool. So, uh, like you mentioned earlier, you kind of want to blend the sports science realm and the strength and conditioning. So a lot of times like maybe I'm looking at the wrong stuff, but a lot of times I feel like the research are just for research.
Hmm.
I feel like a lot of times you have to have experience to know how to really put those research into practice, right? But at the same time, since they already have that much of the experience, I feel like research sometimes not that helpful. So, like in terms of like bridging these two gaps, like maybe start by what kind of research will you uh look into, or like how do you find like those research that's going to be helpful for practitioners?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I'm super passionate about, and it's definitely kind of a limitation in our current sports science field. I think is a lot of times there is a gap between kind of the published research and the academic side and what's being applied by practitioners. So I think what it comes down to is that I think researchers and practitioners have to work together. I think there has to be communication between the two. Um, that can look a number of different that can look very different in different places. For example, when I was at Kansas and we in our lab we had an advisory board, and that advisory board to the lab didn't consist of any other researchers. It all consisted of, applied practitioners, strength and conditioning coaches, sport coaches, rehab professionals, because at the end of the day, and I'm strictly speaking here for like the sports science research realm, at the end of the day, if research is not being translated into practice, then we really should question its usability. And a lot of it, is kind of driven by some bigger flaws in the academic setting, like the publish or perish culture, as researchers have to publish certain amount of papers to get promotion and all this stuff. So that's a discussion for a different day. But I think yes, I think researchers and practitioners need to work together because the questions are coming from the practitioners. The questions are coming from the practitioners and the coaches and those people, and then the researchers help those people by using their scientific research knowledge, their stats knowledge, all that stuff, help the practitioners answer those questions. And I think there's a number of different models that can be very helpful. I've talked about this before and written about it before, whether that's on LinkedIn, but for example, the applied research model for the sports sciences by Bishop was introduced in 2008. That's something that I've used as a guide for my dissertation, and I think it's a neat way for researchers to make sure that they are answering a question that is worth answering, and that in the process making sure they jump through those hoops to ensure that the answer that they come up with in the end can have an impact in practice and can help practitioners. But yeah, I think a number of different ways that would help, I think, are things like laboratories having like advisory boards consisting of practitioners, conversation at conferences, those types of things. Integrated master's and PhD programs where like a researcher is integrated with like an athletic department or a sports team and creating crosstalk through that. I think those are some avenues worth exploring. And then I think from like a practitioner side, finding research that is applicable to your setting, I think it just takes time. It just takes getting more comfortable reading scientific literature, but then also maybe going to journals where they are a little bit more practitioner oriented. For example, the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. Obviously, the NSCA is very practitioner oriented. At the end of each paper, there's a practical application setting. So maybe going more towards those as a practitioner starting out in reading and finding research could be. could be good.
Cool. And uh early on in your career, do you find that there's times that you feel like there's a gap between like sports science and strength and conditioning, and how do you kind of like bridge the gap?
Yeah, I think there is a gap in a lot of ways. I think a lot of times the S&C coaches think of the scientists in the labs more of like, oh, they're just the nerds up there on campus studying mice and all that stuff, and how does that apply to us? And then the scientists think like, oh, like the meatheads down in the weight room, they think they're so far ahead of the research with all their meathead methods when in reality the answer is communication and working together and acknowledging that both parties have their own set of skills, which is awesome because then the practitioners who work with the athletes every day can come up with the questions that they need answered and then have the assistance of the researchers in answering those questions, and then by working together in the process, uh putting that information out there in a manner that's digestible and applicable to practitioners.
Cool, cool. And I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like nowadays a lot of high level strength coaches, they also have like great knowledge in like the sports science, right? So what do you think the future of like the sports? Do you think there's gonna be pure sports science role in the future, or it's gonna be more of a like data science or like biomechanics?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that I get too, just because I have, for example, in my case, I have sports science and strength and conditioning in my title. So people are like, well, do you see yourself more as a sports scientist or more as a strength coach? Like currently, I'd probably say I'm more of a sports scientist, but for me to be able to do my best work as a sports scientist, I need to be boots on the ground. I need to be in the trenches with the coaches and the practitioners to understand what types of questions the coaches have, the athletes have, the PTs, the ATs have. And if I'm someone that only sits behind a computer desk and only has skills and knowledge in, let's say, data science, then I will most likely struggle in using my stats knowledge, my data knowledge, my research knowledge to answer those types of questions. So I'm sure there will be, and there already is, like strictly data positions, strictly sports science positions. But I think even if you are in a position like that, you need to watch practice, watch lifts, talk to coaches, talk to PTs, ATs, strength coaches, in order to come up with good questions to answer. Because I think everything should start with a question, and that's, another kind of like issue that I would say we face in sports science is that a lot of times we start with a technology in mind. It's kind of like an arms race, right? It's like, oh, our conference rival has two force plates. Now we got to get three force plates. Like our conference rival has 100 catapult units. Now we also got to get 100 catapult units. But then like, okay, cool. Now you have 100 catapult units. Like good luck with the workflow of putting them on, taking them off, downloading the data, visualizing the data, commuting the data. But if you start with a question first and you're like, oh man, like I would really like to objectify our return to play process from like a force generation standpoint. Okay, what's the gold standard for doing so? It's probably a force plate. Okay, then we can start having the conversation about do we want to implement a force plate. But I think, long story short, I think a lot of times we kind of have that backwards.
Yeah, yeah. So, this is just me asking. So, do you like sports science more or like coaching more?
I mean, I think they both are appealing and I do enjoy both very much. And I think both are necessary to do a good job in each respective category. I think with the way my career has evolved, like I said, I'd probably be more so on the sports science side of things. I really have a curious mind when it comes to answering questions that relate to human and sporting performance. And I like, using research models and statistics and data and all that kind of stuff. But like I said, my background is in strength and conditioning, and I do appreciate and enjoy the coaching side. And I think it is to a certain extent necessary for me to be a good sports scientist is to, be in the trenches and understand what's going on to be able to then help those around me with the sports science work that I do.
Nice, nice. So, I feel like with my experience, like the first 6 years of my career, I was in Taiwan, like coaching basketball, whatsoever athletes. And we like, I don't like in Taiwan, we don't have force plate, like no catapult, not to mention 1080 sprint. We got nothing but like coaching eye. You really have to train like your coaching eye to watch how athlete moves and like trying to get something from those details. And when I come to the state, you like come to Louisville, you really got everything you want. Force plate, catapult, motion capture, 1080, like literally everything you can dream of. And I do feel like having the coaching experience like the first 6 years just purely watching how athlete moves are like better help me better connect the dots like faster and understand like what's going on better than other coaches.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm glad you said that because I just recently talked to someone else about this. I'm not gonna talk about it so much from a perspective of like the coaching eye and coaching, but I'm more so gonna take a little like spin towards sports science on it. But I can definitely relate because my first 4 years kind of in the profession and doing, the strength and conditioning and the sports science, like I was at a, smaller Division 2 school in Missouri and, let's say what did we have? We had a just jump mat, we had a couple of tendo units, and we had a stopwatch and a measuring stick. We didn't even have timing gates yet. So you got to be really, really good at coming up with a question because you don't really have all the fancy technology. And I think a lot of times people confuse sports science with technology. Sports science, I think, is applying research and scientific principles to answer questions about sporting performance. And so I really appreciate having had that experience because we did do sports science. We did do sports science with a stopwatch and a Tendo unit and a just jump mat and a yardstick. And I think we did good work, but we always started with a question in mind first and then used what we had at hand. And then, I transitioned on to my PhD at Kansas, where we're super, super fortunate to have an awesome lab. Like we had anything that you could think of from 3D motion capture, markerless motion capture, force plates, three-dimensional force plates, unidimensional force plates, radar technology, what have you. And it was awesome. But a lot of times you get stuck in those like paralysis by analysis loops, I think, or you think of a technology that you'd like to work with before even coming up with a good question. But I think that skill set that I built by having those limited resources kind of helped me be better at asking a question that could potentially be worthwhile pursuing and then using, the gold standard technology to try and answer that question rather than the other way around. So yeah, there's definitely some carryover there between our stories there.
Nice, nice. So I guess my next question would be like, what are like some questions you're trying to figure out right now or trying to like answer it right now? Trying to find out the answer.
Yeah, I think not necessarily like at the moment in the situation that I'm in right now, but this has started years ago. I think some questions that I'm interested in always are, can we become better at assessing horizontal deceleration, change of direction, based on game demands in this case for basketball. I've always been interested in utilizing force plates. During my PhD, we did a lot of work for monitoring neuromuscular fatigue and kind of the different force time metrics that we get from different assessments and how they respond to acute, more chronic fatigue, those types of things. That's something I'm always interested in continuing to pursue. Um, and yeah, I mean it's really cool being just, full-time embedded in a sports setting because there's just so many questions to answer. And a lot of those questions aren't necessarily driven by me, they're driven by people around me, which is awesome because that's what you're doing the job for, is to help those around you be better at what they're doing. But yeah, those are some things that I'm currently still interested in.
Nice, nice. So, um, I feel like change direction or like deceleration are like a huge topic in basketball world right now. And I'm not necessarily saying that we have the answer or anyone have the answer right now, but uh, with like I think with the league are getting like motion capture and 3D force plate, like do you think that's gonna solve the problem like faster?
Uh, Possibly. It probably depends on
How
how you,
fast they're gonna
how you,
process data?
yeah, that to begin with. Are you talking like the in-game like Hawkeye, or are you talking more
Yeah,
like the biomechanics initiative?
probably the biomechanics.
Yeah, so I think that's a definitely a step in the right direction. I think whether or not it's going to help accelerate answering those types of questions probably depends on the how practitioners are utilizing that space. Because there is a set battery that's required moving forward. And currently that battery doesn't involve any kind of, horizontal deceleration or change of direction assessment. Doesn't mean it won't come in the future, but that also doesn't mean you can't do it, right? Just because it's not part of that mandatory battery doesn't mean that you as a practitioner can't further investigate. So I think it's just going to be another tool in the toolbox that we could use to answer certain types of questions or get more nuanced kinetic and kinematic information on those types of movements. And yeah, and then the other piece, kind of like the in-game biomechanical information, like that's probably somewhat of an arms race too right now is companies trying to figure out how to harness that information and teams figuring out how to harness this information, but it's so data heavy that it's going to take, a different type of skills and data management expertise to, build good frameworks for that stuff. But yeah, I think it certainly can help accelerate our understanding of these movement qualities, but it's probably going to be different from practitioner to practitioner, team to team, those types of things.
Cool. All right, so last part of the podcast, I want to ask you like you work with like you mentioned like resources limited environment and places like Kansas and now you're in the league. Like what are like the difference between those three settings and what do you learn throughout the journey?
Yeah, I think those are all very different settings, right? You go from like a Division 2 athletic program where you have very limited resources from like a technology standpoint, but also from a like human resources. perspective, meaning we had, I think, one coach, two GAs for like 17 teams and over 500 athletes. So I think your approach to strength and conditioning is going to be a lot different than it is in like a current setting where you have two or three coaches for 15 athletes. And a lot of times it's like one athlete and three coaches. So you can be a lot more detailed. And then the college setting differs from the professional setting. Obviously now with NIL and all that kind of stuff and revenue sharing, like I think the college setting is also going to move towards professional setting, but I think they all complemented each other and helped me where I am now. And I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is it's always about people. It's always gonna be more so about the soft skills than the hard skills. You can always upscale and learn about a technology, learn to code, read another strength and conditioning book, learn another periodization technique. But I think at the end of the day, what makes this enjoyable and what I think leads to the most successful outcomes in the end is just, building good relationships with the players, with the people around you that you work with. Not forgetting about your social life and life outside of the profession. Um, so yeah.
Cool. It's actually pretty cool that till this day that we got AI, ChatGPT, Grok, what like literally anything can dream of technology, like but coaches or even sports scientists are still talking about relationship and like talking to the people. That's really awesome.
Yeah, no, and it's really cool to see. Obviously, those AI tools, they're going to help speed up certain things in certain ways. But at the end of the day, it's still about relationships. The relationship help you come up with a question, communicate the question, disseminate the information, build good relationships. So yeah, I think we're still ways away from us humans being replaced completely.
Nice. So, for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, I know you post like your work, like your research on LinkedIn. So where can they find you?
Yeah, I'd say if you're interested in like professional content, I'd say I'm most active on LinkedIn, just Nico Philipp, Philipp, Nico with a C. Um, I'm on Instagram. I think it's Dr. period Nico underscore PHP. I don't post as much like sports science, strength and conditioning stuff on there. I think I'm also on Twitter, just Nico Phillips. So yeah, those are kind of where you can find me and always open to chatting. And if you want to shoot me an email, that's cool too. So yeah.
Nice, nice.